Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu from the INH Center for Islamic Eschatology in Fez, Morocco. And I'm happy to present Sheikh Imran Hosein's work explaining Israel's mysterious imperial agenda as an audiobook. And before that, a short essay from the same book entitled Gog, Magog, and Jerusalem. In Surah Al-Kahf, the chapter of the cave, chapter 18 of the Quran, as well as in prophetic commentary, Gog and Magog are described as two people created by Allah Most High and endowed with awesome power. None but I can destroy them, said Allah. They had to be contained behind an iron barrier because they used their power for evil ends, to commit fasad, acts of wickedness, oppression, and corruption. The Quran also implied that they would use power to wage war on those who lived lives of faith and righteousness, and that they would act malevolently against those who lived the primitive way of life, or who eked out a bare subsistence living. Thus, the picture emerged of people who had the hearts of beasts. The Quran went on to inform that when the last age commenced, Allah would bring down the barrier, and Gog and Magog, who are a major sign of the last age, would be released into the world. They would eventually spread out in every direction, indicating that with their invincible power, they would take control of the whole world, and that for the first time in history, one people would rule all of mankind. But since that world order would witness oppression and war on religion, it would be in total conflict with the heavenly order above. No believer could possibly be comfortable with mainstream society in such a world. In the chapter entitled Al-Anbiya, the Prophets, chapter 21, the Quran referred one more time to Gog and Magog, while making mention of a town that Allah destroyed and its people expelled and banned from returning to reclaim their town until Gog and Magog had been released and had spread out in every direction. Those whose spiritual vision is illumined by light that comes from Allah Most High can recognize both the town and the Gog Magog world order. That light gives them the capacity to penetrate the internal reality of things. The town is Jerusalem. Allah Most High destroyed that town and expelled the Jews from it. They were then banned from returning to it to reclaim it as their own. Today, they have returned and have reclaimed it as their own, but they have done so while riding the backs of an essentially godless people whose power is such that they have taken total control of the whole world, and who relentlessly use that power to oppress mankind and to wage war on Islam in general and on Arabs in particular. From the time of medieval Euro-Christendom to the age of modern secular Western civilization, Europe has progressively displayed the characteristics of the world order of Gog and Magog, and has also fulfilled their basic mission. European people in Europe, North America, and in the Holy Land today control the whole world. They use power to oppress and to corrupt. They liberated the Holy Land and brought the Jews back to it to reclaim it as their own. They created the secular, godless state of Euro-Israel and presented it to the non-European Jews as David's holy Israel. It is an indication of the utter spiritual blindness of the non-European Jewish people that they allowed themselves to be deceived and led down the road to their final destruction by Gog and Magog. Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah Most High be upon him, has provided additional information on Gog and Magog. For example, he said, None of them dies without leaving 1,000 more behind. And so the reality of contemporary globalization that is taking mankind to the greatest slavery of all can now be understood. Explaining Israel's mysterious imperial agenda. Neither did David the prophet, nor did Solomon, peace be upon them both, ever wage war the Israeli way, with a barbarian ethical code of warfare which permits the indiscriminate bombing destruction of entire civilian populations, men, women and children, in their homes, villages, temples and bomb shelters, as well as the destruction of civilian airports, roads, bridges, electricity power plants, waterworks, etc., and the displacement of almost half the population of a country as refugees fleeing for their lives. Only the beast of the earth wages war that way. When Harry Belafonte declared that former US President George W. Bush was the world's greatest terrorist, it was clear that he had not studied the subject sufficiently, since that notorious distinction belongs to Israel and not to Bush. However, Belafonte certainly showed greater understanding of the subject and more courage and integrity than most politicians and other leaders today. But Israel has another unique distinction that continuously escapes the attention of scribes, scholars, and politicians. It is the only state in the world which has continuously waged unjust war with disdain for Gentile opinion. Indeed, it even escalates its warfare while rendering the rest of the world powerless to do anything tangible to prevent it. The rest of the world, that is, except Islam. We do not, of course, refer above to the present political leaders of the Muslim world who remain largely muted on the subject because of the subservient roles that they must play in order to survive as governments or to become governments, subservient, that is, to those who now rule the world on Israel's behalf. Despite this monstrous betrayal of Islam, there are millions of cattle with Muslim names who blindly and faithfully support such political parties and politicians and vote them into power or back to power again and again. Israel's deliberately barbarous and disproportionate military response in December 2008 to the Sunni Islamic resistance's capture of one enemy soldier in the Gaza Strip and the further capture of 2 more enemy soldiers by the Shia Islamic resistance in southern Lebanon not only constituted yet another Israeli war crime, but also set up Israel once again for eventual retributive punishment that would be commensurate with all those war crimes. Neither did David the prophet, nor did Solomon, peace be upon them both, ever wage war the Israeli way, with a barbarian ethical code of warfare which permits the indiscriminate bombing destruction of entire civilian populations, men, women, and children in their homes, villages, temples, and bomb shelters. 60 were killed in a village bomb shelter in Qana, including 37 children, as well as the destruction of civilian airports, roads, bridges, electricity power plants, waterworks, etc., and the displacement of almost half the population of a country as refugees fleeing for their lives. Only the beast of the earth wages war that way. One can only wonder why the Israelite Jews, who lived in peace with Muslims in the Muslim world for more than 1,000 years prior to the birth of the Euro-Jewish state of Israel, have not as yet asked themselves whether Israel's Euro-Jewish rulers are really Jews or whether they are Euro-barbarians who disguise themselves as Jews. Even though Harun Yahya and Al Jazeera do not know it, and it appears do not want to know it, the rest of the world must know that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has prophesied Israel's final and just retribution at the hands of a Muslim army. Israel has already had a taste of that coming retribution. In an essay published in Trinidad's Daily Express, columnist Rafiq Shah, himself trained in military strategy, described what happened when Israel attempted a ground assault on the southern Lebanese village of Bint Jabil. Having pounded the enemy for days, they thought they would have encountered only rubble. Instead, they ran into ambush after ambush, mounted by men seasoned in desert warfare. Within hours, 11 Israeli soldiers lay dead, with scores more seriously wounded. The wounded were crying in agony as the Hezbollah fighters poured more fire on them. It took the Israelis several hours to extricate their troops, and that only by using their finest tanks as ambulances. Reporters on the Israeli side of the border wrote of weeping commanders and soldiers, dazed by a taste of real battle, wandering back to safety like a bedraggled, defeated army. Bint Jabil in Arabic means Jabil's daughter, while Bin or Ibn Jabil would be his son. Israel must now pause and wonder, if Bint Jabil could fight so fiercely and courageously, how will Bin Jabil fight tomorrow? Israel's final retribution, as prophesied by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in words that are engraved in the hearts of millions of Muslims around the world, would come to pass only after Jesus, peace be upon him, returns. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam declared, "You will fight the Jews and you will defeat them, to such an extent that even a stone would speak and would say, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so come and kill him.'" Bukhari and Muslim. That prophecy suffices today to distinguish the true Muslim from the pseudo-Muslim. The true Muslim is unafraid to declare that the jihad, just war, to liberate the Holy Land from Israeli oppression has already begun. Pseudo-Muslims, from captain to cook, hurry to distance themselves from any armed struggle, while insisting that jihad is an exclusive inner, moral and spiritual struggle, and has nothing at all to do with that just armed struggle. That prophecy also distinguishes between the Jew who opposes Israeli oppression and those who support it. It is the Jew who supports Israel and Israeli oppression who will be hunted down behind stones and trees on that day. The enemies of Islam can bite their fingertips in frustration and with rage as they criticize and condemn those powerful words of the Prophet as incitement to terrorism. Misguided Muslim apologists can exhaust the ink in their pens as they furiously deny that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam ever made such a prophecy. They can even try to sugarcoat those prophetic words with a progressive interpretation. Israel can go on to attack Iran and Pakistan and to madly destroy even more of the Arab Muslim world after destroying Gaza and Lebanon. Yet none can avert the eventual fulfillment of the Prophet ﷺ's prophecy that Islam's armed resistance to Israeli oppression would eventually be successful. On that day of success, when even the stones would speak, Islam would have triumphed over all her rivals. It is important for our readers to note that tomorrow's triumph of Islam would be the triumph of those Muslims who today are demonized as terrorists and are gleefully hunted down by nearly all so-called Muslim governments and armed forces, Pakistan's in particular. While the final success of that armed resistance and retributive punishment on Israel would have to wait until Jesus, peace be upon him, returns, it is quite likely that Israel's present political and military leadership would take the world to the brink of utter destruction if and when Israel launches so-called preemptive nuclear attacks on Iran and Pakistan. Such a nuclear attack on Iran or Pakistan would be designed to provoke that country, in the unlikely event that Iran already possesses nuclear weapons, to retaliate in kind. If Iran does not do so, Israel would still press on to destroy all Iranian nuclear power plants and other related infrastructures that could possibly be used for the development of an indigenous Iranian nuclear deterrent. If Iran does possess nuclear weapons purchased from others and chooses to retaliate with them, such a so-called preemptive Israeli nuclear attack could eventually result in the death of hundreds of thousands of both Israelis and Iranians, and that would land us all in the pit of blazing fire. If it turns out that Iran did not possess nuclear weapons, then Iranian Gentile deaths do not really count as deaths with God's so-called chosen people. An Israeli nuclear attack on Iran could ignite such disastrous economic and monetary crises around the world that the present Pax Americana world order would collapse and be replaced by another world order dominated by Israel. In fact, an attack on Pakistan's nuclear facilities will also trigger off the same consequences. I believe that Israel no longer has any use for a United Nations organization that has already been successfully used to protect the Jewish state through infancy and childhood to her present superpower status. The UN would be a cumbersome hindrance for the universal messianic dictatorship that would be Pax Judaica. Perhaps the deliberate and contemptuous murder of 4 UN observer personnel that resulted from the recent Israeli bombing of the UN observer post in southern Lebanon was meant to deliver to the world a message that the UN's days are now numbered. Islam, the religion, is the only significant force in the world today, offering armed resistance to oppression in and around what should properly be known as the Holy Land. Islam now occupies center stage in international affairs, and the central importance of the religion can only increase as Israel relentlessly pursues the realization of her messianic destiny with an abandon that defies both morality and common sense. Islam alone is both accurately explaining the strange world today and is correctly anticipating tomorrow's even more horrendously evil world. And yet, while others have privileged access to the media to articulate their viewpoint in a country which declares, "Here every creed and race finds an equal place," there is no column on Islam in any daily newspaper in Trinidad and Tobago. This Muslim scribe, who is a senior Islamic scholar and writer in the country, is forced to solicit donations with which to buy expensive newspaper space in order to explain the Islamic viewpoint on such crucially important subjects as addressed in this essay. He also has to correct misinformation and downright lies about Islam from the malicious pens of an ever-increasing number of crusading scribes who with a straight face would attempt to convince readers to accept a kiskadeh, a favorite local bird, to be a corbeau, a vulture. One of them just explained to us, again with a straight face, that when Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam declared a people who choose a woman to rule over them would never be successful, what he really meant in her progressive interpretation was that it was permissible for Muslims to choose a woman to rule over them. This writer also has to constantly defend against devilish attempts at character assassination that maliciously seek to portray him as a terrorist and a great security risk. And if that was not enough, he has to prepare himself for the new so-called democratic dispensation now underway, i.e. the tribal dictatorship and police state that this country's ruling tribe is pursuing with pig-headed determination, when freedom to buy even newspaper space would also be denied to Islam. 3 stages of a master plan. This essay suggests the existence of 3 basic stages in a mysteriously unfolding master plan through which Israel seeks to realize her messianic destiny. The master plan is culminating at this time when the so-called chosen people have been mysteriously brought back from 2,000 years of exile to reclaim the Holy Land as their own. Their ultimate destiny, they believe, is to rule the world from what would appear to be a restored, biblical holy state of Israel located in the Holy Land. The word rule is continuously italicized because of the pivotal place it occupies in the mission of the Antichrist. That ultimate destiny appears soon to be realized, and so it is time enough for our readers to try to understand the subject from the perspective of Islamic eschatology. In explaining those 3 stages of the master plan, we can, in fact, also explain much of the history of international politics and economics over the last few centuries. In the first of the 3 stages, which lasted for a long time, a Pax Britannica world order waged strange colonial wars on the rest of the world and eventually and cleverly succeeded in liberating the Holy Land from benevolent Muslim rule and in presiding over the birth of the imposter Euro-Jewish state of Israel. Along the way, the world witnessed the strange and otherwise inexplicable event of a secular Britain pledging, in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the secular British government's commitment to deliver a national homeland in the Holy Land to the Jewish people. Our thesis offers to readers an explanation for that mysterious British obsession with the Holy Land. We must also carefully note that in the effort to establish itself as the ruling state in the world, Britain had to take the initial steps towards control of the world's money. And so the British sterling pound became the international currency, and Britain became the moneylender par excellence of the world. This was a unique event in monetary history. Then, in the second stage of that master plan, a stage which appears to be now ending and which will consequently last for a much shorter time than the first, a Pax Americana world order replaced Pax Britannica and proceeded to mysteriously protect the arrogant, aggressive, and expansionist Euro-Jewish state with countless UN Security Council vetoes. That world order has also continuously waged wars on Israel's behalf in order to make the world safe for Israel to grow into a nuclear-armed superpower. Instead of the spectacular colonial wars which delivered to Britain the status of a ruling state, it took 2 world wars to bring about the transfer of power from the first to the second ruling state. Our thesis offers to readers an explanation for that equally mysterious American obsession with the Holy Land. There was, in addition, a monetary component to the process of the emergence of the USA as the second ruling state, since the US dollar replaced the sterling pound as the international currency, and USA became the moneylender par excellence of the world. The history of these 2 ruling states, Britain and USA, suggests that whoever achieves control over the world's money can also control the world. Control over money can be used to prevent the circulation of wealth through the economy, thus ensuring that the rich remain permanently rich and the poor permanently poor. Control over money could also be used to buy the allegiance of the rich, who would grow constantly richer and who would join the oppressor and assist him in controlling the world. It would also reduce the poor to such impotence that they become helpless to resist oppression. That is precisely the state of the world today, and it constitutes a critically important goal of the master plan. And then, in the third, final, and briefest stage of the master plan, a Pax Judaica world order is about to replace Pax Americana. The passage from the second to the third and final ruling state in the master plan is again taking place through a series of strange wars. Israel would soon replace USA as the ruling state in the world, and when that occurs, a Jew would eventually rule the world from Jerusalem and claim to be the true Messiah. But he would not be Jesus, the true Messiah. Rather, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam explained that he would be Dajjal, the false Messiah, the Antichrist. We are now very close indeed to the culmination of that devilish master plan that has been ominously unfolding ever since the small island Britain startled the world a few centuries ago by becoming the first ruling state in post-biblical history, i.e., since David and Solomon created the world's first ruling state. Terrorism and the master plan. The passage from the first to the second stage of the master plan was initiated through an act of carefully planned terrorism, i.e., the assassination of the Grand Duke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo in the summer of 1914. Those who planned the assassination also planted false footprints at the crime scene that led to Russia. It paved the way for the First World War, which in turn was successfully used to dismember the Ottoman Islamic Empire and to liberate, i.e., from the Jewish perspective, the Holy Land. The passage from the second to the third stage of the master plan was also initiated through an act of less carefully planned terrorism, i.e., the 9/11 terrorist attack on America. This time around, the false footprints that were planted at the crime scene led to Arabs and Muslims, and that created opportunities for an arrogant and power-drunk USA and its Euro allies to wage a series of wars still in progress to eventually impose total control over the world's major oil resources that were not already controlled, hence American war on Afghanistan and Iraq and Israeli wars on Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and eventually Syria and Iran. War on Venezuela as well seems inevitable, and that perhaps explains the haste with which the ruling tribe in Trinidad and Tobago was seeking to establish a tribal dictatorship. Today's wars also allow the USA and Israel to eventually control the new electronic money system of the world that would soon replace paper money when the US dollar collapses. Anti-terrorism legislation and war on terrorism, which is a euphemism for war on Islam, would eventually pave the way in the name of international security for the imposition of a new international monetary system of electronic money. That monetary system would make the world even safer for Israel, since anyone who dared to oppose Israel could be targeted as a terrorist and could have his wealth electronically short-circuited. The most important point this essay makes is the world is now located at that moment in time when stage 2 of the master plan is culminating and stage 3 is commencing. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the master plan, and 666. I believe that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam prophesied these 3 stages of the master plan, i.e., the ultimate world system through which Dajjal, the false Messiah, Antichrist, would eventually accomplish his mission of impersonating the true Messiah and thus of ruling the world from an imposter state of Israel in the Holy Land. The Prophet said, when Dajjal is released, he would live on earth for 40 days, a day like a year, a day like a month, a day like a week, and all his days, i.e. all the rest of his days, like your days. Sahih Muslim. He also prophesied in what has come to be known as the Hadith of Tamim ad-Dari, that Dajjal's initial base, i.e. in the first stage of his mission that would last for a day like a year, would be an island which specialized in spying and was located about 1 month's journey by sea from Arabia. I believe that island could not have been other than Britain. The Bible described the very same 3-stage process that would culminate with a new international monetary system of electronic money and with the Antichrist ruling the world from Jerusalem. It did so when it declared, "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Revelation 13:16-18. When the Bible's religious symbolism is analyzed, it clearly reveals that the number 600 in relation to the Antichrist refers to the first stage of the master plan that lasted for a long time and witnessed the emergence of the first ruling state in post-biblical history and to Pax Britannica. The number 30 refers to the present second stage that lasts for a shorter period of time and witnesses the emergence of the second ruling state and to Pax Americana. Finally, the number 6 refers to the third and last stage of the master plan, with which the Antichrist finally completes his mission and emerges in human form to rule the world from Jerusalem and from an imposter ruling state of Israel with Pax Judaica. The most distinctive features of that unfolding master plan from its very beginning with the Euro-Christian Crusades to this day have been its godlessness, decadence, deception, and barbaric oppression. Only those who are deaf, dumb, and blind would recognize the above as evidence of divine grace. We now look at differing responses to oppression. Responding to oppression. Muslims who live in the modern age have long been inspired by the Prince of Believers, Malcolm X, who once addressed the subject and explained the differing responses to oppression endured by slaves. The house slave was subject to the same oppression as the field slave. Both were without external freedom and hence in external slavery. But while the field slave hated that oppression and slavery, the house slave submitted to it, identified with the slave master, and accepted his slavery. He was so brainwashed and internally blind that he became an appendage of the slave master. He was always there to serve the slave master, however required, and whenever the slave master needed him. When the slave master was ill, the house slave would feel his master's pain and suffering and would declare to his master, "We sick." The house slave was both internally as well as externally a slave. He became a part of the system of slavery. The internally blind always end up as slaves. The slave master rewarded the house slave for his faithful service by buttering his bread. He still does that today with a US visa or with jobs and protection in exchange for political support for the ruling tribe. Around the world today, house slaves have hoisted themselves or have been hoisted up to become leaders of Muslim communities, governors, prime ministers, presidents, kings, and even queens. The field slave, on the other hand, was externally a slave, but internally a free man. Because of that internal freedom, the field slave had the capacity to see and to thus recognize the slave master's oppression and wickedness, and he hated it with all his heart and soul. The field slave never submitted to oppression and wickedness, but rather longed to regain his freedom and to dismantle the system of slavery. And so the field slave responded to oppression and slavery in a manner that was anti-systemic. The slave master who was an oppressor was his enemy, with whom he would never play football or cricket. Hence, he would also never host either of today's football or cricket World Cup competitions. Instead, when the slave master's house was on fire, the field slave prayed to God to send a strong wind which would burn down the house. The slave master despised the field slave and made him pay a terrible price for his refusal to submit and become a willing part of the system of slavery. Muslims who faithfully follow Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are today's field slaves. Field slaves who dare to offer armed resistance to Israel's barbarous oppression in the Holy Land and elsewhere are today demonized as terrorists. Had Malcolm X been still alive today, it is certain that he would have been declared a terrorist and a great security risk. His entry into most Caribbean states would certainly have been banned. The Anglo-American-Israeli alliance, which today rules the world, once demonized South Africa's African National Congress as a terrorist organization. In fact, the ANC at that time was comprised exclusively of field slaves. Today, of course, there is a house slave, field slave struggle within the ANC. Yesterday's heroic field slave freedom fighters around the world must be turning in their graves as their children succeed them as rulers and are transformed into masses' house slaves. When US President George Bush Jr. was preparing to wage his own unjust war on Iraq, the ANC demonstrated courage and integrity in responding with a massive street demonstration of protest. I marched with them in Johannesburg 3 years ago on a bright sunny February morning when Zulu dancers stole my heart with their hauntingly beautiful tribal chants and dances, and Nelson Mandela defiantly denounced the war as an attempt to steal Iraq's oil. Former Malaysian Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir also did not hesitate to denounce both the war on Iraq as well as the 9/11 terrorist attack on America as events planned and executed on Israel's behalf. Trinidad and Tobago's tribal government could not have been unaware of the shameful implications of Prime Minister Manning's ill-advised diplomatic pilgrimage to Jerusalem, in which he confirmed his government's friendship for the Euro-Jewish state of Israel. Perhaps this extraordinary, high-profile diplomatic initiative was required of him because an Israeli national was embarrassingly caught red-handed while holed up in a forest shack close to the town of Aruca in illegal possession of a Trinidad and Tobago immigration stamp. Had he who was so caught been a Muslim, he would never have been allowed to fly out of the country with a light $2,000 court fine and with nary a hint of any charge connected to terrorism. Around the world today, Massa's native house slaves would have eagerly consented to his extradition to that curious new manifestation of Republican America's great symbol of democracy, i.e., a torture camp in Guantanamo, where American military personnel have been known to urinate on copies of the Quran and to even flush copies of the Holy Book down the toilet. Apart from a few misguided so-called Muslim leaders in Trinidad and Tobago who share with this country's ruling tribe an embarrassing friendship for the oppressor state of Israel, most local Muslims oppose the Euro-Jewish state, and many would gladly join in the struggle for liberation from Israeli oppression. They are not alone in their opposition to that oppression, as is evident from recent essays by David Abdullah and Rafiq Shah, published in local newspapers. Indeed, as long ago as the 17th century, the English poet John Donne, 1572 to 1631, recognized in verse what the ruling tribe in this country still cannot recognize. And when the chosen people grew more strong, their righteous cause became the wrong. As the full picture of Israel's continuing aerial bombardment and destruction of Gaza and Lebanon continues to unfold, and as Israel continues to expand the mad war of destruction now underway, perhaps to test whether Iran has nuclear weapons, we can confidently expect more people of this country to denounce Israel for its war crimes. Politicians, however, and regretfully so, hardly ever muster the integrity and fortitude to call a spade when Israel happens to be the spade. The Christian view of the subject. Many Christians declare that the birth of the Euro-Jewish state of Israel was an act of divine grace that fulfilled biblical prophecy. It was also divine grace in their view, which explained the seemingly miraculous return of the Jews to the Holy Land to reclaim it as their own, some 2,000 years after they were expelled therefrom by divine decree. Such misguided people do not pause to consider that the essentially godless, decadent, and oppressive Euro world order that liberated the Holy Land from benevolent Muslim rule and made possible the return of the Jews to that Holy Land could not possibly have been an instrument of such divine grace, since truth is incompatible with godlessness, decadence, and oppression. They believe that today's Euro-Jewish state of Israel is destined to rule the world, and that its destiny would finally be realized with crowning glory when God Himself, in the person of the true Messiah, the Son of the Virgin Mary, returns to rule the world from Jerusalem. They believe that end of history to be now close at hand, and when it does materialize, They believe it would confirm the Christian claim to truth. In the meantime, they insist that every bloody step that Israel takes to expand her control over territory and to impose her authority over the surrounding Arab Muslim world must be supported, since it fulfills corrupted imperialist biblical prophecy. Every spot on which your foot treads shall be yours. Deuteronomy 11:24. They close their eyes to Israel's shedding of innocent blood, since they believe that the evil Israeli war dance is morally and spiritually justified in the context of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. According to Christian supporters, Israel's conduct may appear to be that of an oppressor, but there is a mysterious moral philosophy somewhere in the universe, perhaps in Hollywood, that exonerates Israel and justifies as divine punishment the oppression and wanton slaughter that she has unleashed on largely defenseless Arabs, Christians as well as Muslims. They regard all those who oppose and resist Israel to be evil, and since the true followers of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam remain the only significant force resisting the Euro-Jewish state's oppression, they consider Muslims to be the most evil people in the world. When David Abdullah asked, "Has Israel gone mad?" and Rafiq Shah warned, "Don't cry for Israel when retribution comes," they probably blamed the misguidance of these two scribes on the Muslim connection implicit in their names. They are convinced that Muslims must be the evil Gog and Magog tribes mentioned in their scriptures, and that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam must have been the Antichrist. The Jewish view of the subject. If the evangelical Christian view of modern-day Israel is so difficult to digest, what are we to make of the prevalent Jewish view that believes Jesus to be a bastard and false Messiah, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to be a false prophet? Most Jews believe that the birth of modern Israel and the return of the Jews to the Holy Land herald the imminent advent of the true Messiah, who would rule the world from Jerusalem, and through whom truth in Judaism would be validated. Such validation of truth in Judaism, they believe, would ipso facto invalidate Christian and Muslim claims to truth, and would also confirm the Jews as the chosen people to whom God had granted the Holy Land unconditionally and in perpetuity. Now, the secularism of modern Western civilization has led Western society increasingly towards atheism and godlessness. The West also has a despicable record of oppression of non-Europeans. People who worship the God of Abraham cannot become allies of those with a record of such atheism, godlessness, and oppression. But Jewish Israel believes that it has a divine right to use whatever means may be necessary to realize its goal of ruling the world from Jerusalem, since the end justifies the means. What also appears to Israel's critics as oppression and barbarism on Ishmaelite Muslims is, in their view, divine punishment that is justified by the Torah. How so? Arabs and Muslims have descended from Abraham's son, Ishmael, who was condemned in the Torah as a wild ass of a man, his hand against every man, i.e. he is a bandit, and everyone's hand against him, i.e. all of mankind would hate him and fight against him. Genesis 16:12. The Torah also falsely proclaimed that the Holy Land was given to the seed of Abraham through Isaac, Ishmael being falsely excluded as legitimate seed, and that the Israelite claim to the title deed of the Holy Land remains valid, regardless of whether or not they are righteous in conduct. Know, therefore, that it is not for thy righteousness that thy Lord thy God giveth thee this good land to possess it, for thou art a stiff-necked people. Deuteronomy 9:6. But most alarming of all is the Torah's frontiers of the Holy Land. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." Genesis 15:18. Our readers can now understand the connection between distortions in a corrupted Torah and Israel's ominously ever-expanding territorial frontiers. The Quran and the Holy Land. The Quran makes a crucially important statement concerning certain Christians and Jews who would eventually emerge in history. It says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لتجدن أشد الناس عداوة للذين آمنوا اليهود والذين أشركوا ولتجدن أقربهم مودة للذين آمنوا الذين قالوا إنا نصارى ذلك بأن منهم قسيسين ورهبانا وأنهم لا يستكبرون. You will find time and again that the most hostile of all people to the believers, i.e. Muslims, would be the Jews and those who are idol worshippers or pagans, and nearest among them in love to the believers would be those who say, "We are Christians," because amongst these are men devoted to learning and men who have renounced the world, and they are not arrogant. Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 82. It prohibits Muslim friendship or alliance with a Judeo-Christian alliance. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا اليهود والنصارى أولياء بعضهم أولياء بعض ومن يتولهم منكم فإنه منهم إن الله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. O you who believe in this Quran, do not take such Jews and the Christians as your friends and allies, who themselves are friends and allies of each other, and whoever of you allies himself with them becomes verily one of them. Behold, Allah does not guide such evildoers. Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 51. It has corrected the falsehood about Ishmael. وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ إِسْمَاعِيلَ إِنَّهُ كَانَ صَادِقَ الْوَعْدِ وَكَانَ رَسُولًا نَبِيًّا وَكَانَ يَأْمُرُ أَهْلَهُ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَالزَّكَاةِ وَكَانَ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ مَرْضِيًّا. Also mentioned in the book the story of Ishmael. He was strictly true to whatever he promised, and he was an apostle and a prophet. He used to enjoin on his people prayer and charity, and he was most acceptable in the sight of his Lord. Quran, Surah Maryam, chapter 19, verses 54 to 55. It has also corrected the falsehood concerning the alleged unconditional grant of the Holy Land to the Israelite people. Rather, Allah Most High granted them the Holy Land conditional on faith in Allah and righteous conduct. وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ. And we declared in both the Torah and the Psalms of David that only our righteous servants shall inherit the earth or land, i.e. the Holy Land. Quran, Surah Al-Anbiya, chapter 21, verse 105. This statement of the Quran is supported by some of the Psalms. But the meek shall inherit the earth or land, i.e. the Holy Land, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. Psalm 37:11. The righteous shall inherit the earth or land, i.e. the Holy Land, and dwell therein forever, i.e. provided that they remain righteous. Psalm 37:29. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth or land, i.e. the Holy Land. Matthew 5:5. The Quran has explained that whenever the Israelites violated the divine conditions of inheritance of the Holy Land, i.e. faith in God and righteous conduct, Allah Most High expelled them from that land. The first expulsion took place after the death of Solomon, peace be upon him, as a consequence of their telling lies about Allah, i.e. rewriting the scriptures to plant falsehoods in them. They were exiled to Babylon. Upon their return to the Holy Land, they again violated those divine conditions when they rebelled against Allah's prophets and killed several of them. They even boasted of how they had crucified Jesus. As a consequence, they were again expelled from the Holy Land. After that last expulsion took place in the wake of the rejection of the true Messiah and the attempt to crucify him, Allah Most High declared, عَسَى رَبُّكُمْ أَن يَرْحَمَكُمْ وَإِنْ عُدْتُمْ عُدْنَا وَجَعَلْنَا جَهَنَّمَ لِلْكَافِرِينَ حَصِيرًا. if you return, i.e. to the Holy Land, with your wickedness and oppression, we would return with our punishment. Quran, Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17, verse 8. The Israelites have today returned to the Holy Land with more wickedness and oppression than ever before, and hence it should be quite clear to those who can recognize wickedness and oppression that divine retributive punishment, as promised in the Quran, is also certain.